We're going to shift gears a bit here because even though we are expecting increased technology and better efficiency and more automation, every area of aviation is seeing a critical need for people to meet the challenges of future growth. Whether you look at military or civilian aviation, flight crew or maintenance, all of these are seeing shortages in key roles to make our air transport business work. Ground operations is seeing this growth in demand. And how do we meet it? Connor Wilcock is going to share the outcome of a recent IATA survey focused on this issue in the ground operations sector, and will share his insight on the challenges we face. Connor. Come on up to the stage. Connor?
Don't hide your emotion. You can throw down your guard and feed from the notion.
I did all my dancing last night.
You taught me something, yeah. Freedom is out. It was you taught me living in togetherness, togetherness, togetherness. I am a giant. Stand up on my shoulders. Tell me what you see. 'Cause I am a giant. We'll be breaking borders underneath our feet.
Do we have Connor? Are we, okay. We're getting him wired for sound. One of my memories growing up as a child, watching airplanes at Dallas Love Field, was watching the crew chiefs do all this business. And that was my dream job as an 8-year-old, I guess, would be to work on the ramp and, get to steer the 707s and Electras and Convair 880s in. Never got that chance. So, Connor, are you ready to come up? Okay.
Morning, everyone. Apologies for that. I promise I don't have a sore head from the gala dinner. I thought I was on at 11:15, but there you go. We're ahead of schedule, which is quite a rarity in the conference world. Let me introduce myself. I'm Connor Wilcock, and I'm a director at B2B International. First things first, I should open up to you and admit that I'm not an expert in ground handling, or at least that's not my full-time job. I am a market researcher, and so my job is to ask questions and then try to look pretty for you and act as a conduit for all the people that answer those questions on my behalf. So what I'm going to do today is not pretend to be an expert in ground handling, but instead introduce some of the key issues that we uncovered when conducting a couple of pieces of research on behalf of IATA over the last 12 months. Specifically, challenges relating to HR. And we're going to cover 3 key themes today, which are interlinked, of course, but we'll cover each one of them separately. Recruitment, training, and retention. Okay? So, let's see if we can move this ahead. So that's the what. What have we done? We've conducted a couple of pieces of market research over the last year to try to understand in detail what those HR challenges are, what companies within the sector are actually doing to overcome those challenges, and what we might learn from those examples. And we're talking here about short, medium, and long-term trends as well. We're not just talking about what we can do overnight, but we're talking about what we might wish to do in the next 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 years as we try to accommodate some of the major changes that are going to be occurring in our sector over that time. So how exactly did we do that? Well, as I said, there are a couple of research projects that were carried out by my company, B2B International, you can see there in the corner. First was a global survey in which we conducted 300 interviews across the sector. Now that covered ground handling, but it also covered civil aviation authorities, airlines, airports, lots of other groups of companies within the broad aviation industry. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the ground handling part of that survey today. But what's more, and I think incredibly important for this presentation, is the follow-up there. So that 300 interview project was very important in sort of getting the numbers, getting a robust set of measurements so that we could understand some of the key challenges that were facing ground handlers in terms of HR, but particularly training. But that follow-up there was very important. 14 sounds like a small number, but if I tell you that we, in the course of doing that study, interviewed 8 of the top 10 ground handlers in the world, then you can start to see that from a very small sample size, we're actually getting a really good understanding of what the industry is facing at the moment. Why is this even important? Why should I be standing in front of you today as a non-aviation outsider, convincing you of the key challenges within this sector and what could or is already being done to overcome those challenges? Well, and I think if we go, can I even go back? I can go back. The title of this presentation today is Major Growth in Ground Handling Jobs Expected, which on the face of it sounds like a fantastic thing, right? 8.2 billion global passengers by 2037. By the way, just for context, that's double what it is today. E-commerce sales, if we think outside of passengers and think about cargo and its impact on ground handling, that's going to double to 5 trillion. So passenger numbers are doubling in the next 18 years. E-commerce, and we're using that as a proxy for the cargo volume, is expected to double in the next 2.5 years. So you can imagine, okay, well, the impact of that, the knock-on effect on our sector is that there are more people and more parcels that need to get transported all over the world. And what countries are doing to prepare for that challenge is they're going to build new aviation megacities. And we're defining an aviation megacity here as any city which accommodates at least 10,000 long-haul passengers every day. Okay? And there are going to be 27 new aviation megacities by 2037, all the way from Copenhagen to Cape Town. That growth is being driven primarily by Europe and Africa and the Middle East. As you might imagine, China and the rest of Asia are already building those megacities, but all of this means that as ground handlers, we need to be able to accommodate those numbers, the increased passenger numbers and increased cargo volume. So, going back to our 3 key themes, recruitment. And by the way, I should say up front that we've put these almost in order of the employee life cycle, right? Recruitment at the beginning, training sort of in the middle, and retention at the end. But actually, I could just have easily have talked about retention, because you only need to recruit people for 2 reasons. 1, to accommodate growth. 2, to accommodate churn, okay? And we'll see later on in my presentation today that churn is a huge, huge challenge within this sector. And I don't think there's one person in this room that's just heard me say something groundbreaking there. I think you're all aware of the issue of churn within this industry, but it bears pointing out here that the impact on recruitment is quite significant. So, why should we be talking about recruitment? Well, our research suggests that in order simply to accommodate the growth in the sector, this is nothing to do with churn, the ground handling sector in total will need to employ about 85,000 more people in 2022 than it had to employ in 2018. So in the space of just 4 years, we're adding almost 20% to the workforce. When we asked ground handlers what the number 1 challenge facing them, in an HR capacity this is, they said recruiting suitable staff is the number 1 challenge facing us. as HR leaders within the sector. And by the way, these numbers or these projections do assume that there will be no advances in automation. So for example, if more ground handlers use automated check-in or self-docking bridges or anything like that, then obviously that would impact the number of people that we are expected to hire. But what we heard time and time again, and what you may have heard a little bit of throughout this conference, is that we talk about automation as if it's going to happen overnight, and it really isn't. Or worse, we talk about it as if it's already happened, it's been and gone. And certainly the wheels are turning, but it isn't going to happen overnight, and therefore we can't just ignore or assume that because of automation or advances in technology that our recruitment challenges go away. Actually, what the world's biggest ground handling companies told us is that we're not going to be even mostly automated, let alone fully automated, for another 10 or 15 years. And so this, if we consider that to be the long-term trend, the short-term problem facing us is that we need to recruit tens of thousands of people a year just to stay still. Okay? One of the biggest recruitment challenges, or the reasons that global ground handlers are facing significant recruitment challenges, is that the global economy is strong. We have here a paradox. As the global economy strengthens, passenger numbers increase, cargo volumes increase, unemployment goes down. And a challenge specific to our sector is that many of the employees that we will need to recruit are entry-level manual workers, okay? And when unemployment is low, that market for entry-level staff is extremely limited. And again, I'm not even pretending for a moment that I'm telling you anything groundbreaking here, but I'm just laying out the results of this research to try and tee up what companies are doing or could be doing to overcome those challenges. What's more, education levels around the world are increasing, and therefore the interest or appeal of entry-level, certainly below-the-wing jobs, is lower. Having said that, what we did find is that many ground handlers actually are seeing a skills shortage, especially in developing markets, language skills being chief among them. So they found that new employees, they're struggling to find new employees that are proficient in English, for example. We know that in aviation, the English language is extremely important. But then there was a generational challenge as well. A few of the ground handlers that we spoke to in detail talked about what was called the WhatsApp generation. So we're talking primarily about above-the-wing services here, so passenger services. They were saying that when trying to recruit millennials and Generation Z or Gen Z employees, they find that their interpersonal skills are somewhat lacking, which I find to be greatly offensive as a millennial myself. But there you go. And you might think, well, actually, if everyone's going to the airport and checking in using a screen, why would interpersonal skills still be so important? Well, what we're seeing is a premiumization of that service element within the industry. So there is going to be a segment of the passenger audience or the passenger universe that really wants that customer service. Okay, maybe it's an older generation, those traveling in business class, whatever it is, we are going to need to recruit people that have those interpersonal skills, and major ground handlers that we spoke to said that they're struggling with that at present. So what's being done? Well, if we talk technology for a second, one thing that the people that we spoke to said was happening was that they are trying to transform digitally the recruitment process using AI and gamification, with two specific examples, to try to get the right people on the bus or on the plane, so to speak. And we're talking here about attitudinal recruitment as well, so it's not just thinking about the specific operational skills that might be required. In fact, many of the people that we spoke to said that their entry-level requirements are simply that you can read, and for some roles that you have a valid driver's license. Everything else, all of the other skills, the operational skills, can be trained and learned on the job. But attitudinal traits are what we really are looking for, because they have been shown to be much more predictive of proficiency and retention. Another thing that was mentioned quite a few times was being clearer to your set of potential recruits about the nature of the work before you hire them. And here we start to see the crossover between recruitment and retention challenges. Obviously, there's a huge issue with churn, which we'll return to later on in the presentation. But one of the reasons that was cited as to why people leave the sector in such high numbers is because they simply weren't aware or knowledgeable enough about the nature of the job before they applied or were actually offered the job itself. One very, very specific example from one of the top 5 ground handlers in the world here was that they're conducting night interviews for night shift workers. If you're expected to work between midnight and 9 a.m., come in for your interview at 2 a.m. and see how that feels, right? Because if it doesn't feel good, it's not going to feel good when you're doing it time and time again on the job itself. So that's the sort of thing, just exposing them and making them more knowledgeable. Because I think there's this problem that, well, or this perhaps misperception that because it's aviation and because it used to be glamorous, there's this misperception that everybody kind of gets it, right? Everyone kind of knows what they're going to be expected to do. That's not the case in the slightest. People are much more likely to know what they'll be required to do if they get a job at McDonald's or KFC or in retail than they are if they work below the wing at an airport. And so just making sure that they're more knowledgeable about what the job actually entails, what the working conditions might be like during that recruitment process. It might seem like that might make your job harder because more people might turn away, but actually that prevents you, if that prevents you from hiring that person and then them leaving after 3 weeks and you having to rehire them, you can see the benefits of that already. The third thing here was resource utilization and technological investment. And to be frank, I have absolutely no idea what that means. I think what we're trying to say to you there on a badly worded PowerPoint slide is that there's a heck of a lot of downtime within the industry, and that's below the wing and above the wing. I was traveling through Edinburgh Airport last week, and I'm waiting to board the plane. I was looking, and I'm doing that always now. Since we started working for IATA, whenever I go to an airport, I'm looking out for ground handling staff. And I saw a group of 3 of them just sitting there for about 20 minutes, waiting for the plane to come in so that they can begin their work. That downtime is a real problem. And it's a real problem for training. We'll talk about that in a moment, but also recruitment. Recruitment is basically how do we get enough people to do the job that we need? Well, if you can better utilize the resource that you already have, it stands to reason that you won't need to recruit as many people. This is a pretty meaty quote, so I apologize for that in advance, but I thought it was worth putting in here because, well, first of all, to show you some of the data in its purest form that we obtained through doing this research. But secondly, I think it's a good summary of some of the things we've just been talking about over the last few minutes. We're an unknown sector. So people don't necessarily know what the job actually is. If they wanted to go to Tesco, for those of you unaware of Tesco, it's a huge supermarket chain, think Walmart, or McDonald's, it's very evident what they're going to do. We're trying to do a lot in the space of bringing to life what it's actually like to work here as part of the recruitment program, with videos and things. Well, there you go. So, some food for thought. As I said, my job is to ask questions. I have the privilege of not being required to answer them on many occasions, so I can actually escape responsibility here and just leave a few questions with you. How can we better use the human resources that we have to reduce the total number of employees that are actually required? And then secondly, the generational challenge that I introduced just now. What impact will millennials and Generation Z, or Z, actually have on this workforce? How can we accommodate their skills or their skills shortages? Secondly, training. We asked ground handlers, what's the tipping point for employee retention, knowing that almost every employee that begins at a company will need to be trained in some form. We know from the research that we've done how expensive this training is, and so we wanted to know how long does it take before you can be confident that your investment in that employee has been returned to you? And we found that the tipping point's about 6 months. What that means is that after 6 months, the chance that that employee will leave in the next 3 to 6 months is dramatically lower. We see a sort of curve like that, okay? Lots of people leave within 6 months. If you reach that 6 months, it's very, very likely that that person will stay, at least for an extended period of time. And therefore, much more likely that your investment in that person, salary, training, etc., will be repaid. If you consider that some of the largest ground handlers, some of you may be sitting here in the room, may have to employ 20,000 new people every single year just to stay still, you can start to think about the costs and how quickly those might escalate. We've estimated some of those here, and we're talking about very big numbers here, by the way, so I'll try to break them down for you. If we take that 20,000 new employees per year figure, we've just assumed, we've been cautious, we've assumed minimum wage, we've not thought about national insurance or tax contributions or anything like that, 170 million euros just in salary. A lot of that, 26 million, by the way, is in the first 2 weeks, and 46 million euros in training costs. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that a large ground handler could save 220 million euros by sorting out their recruitment and churn, but what I am saying is that it doesn't take much in terms of churn reduction or better use of training, more efficient training, for you to save a heck of a lot of money. So, what is the challenge? Well, what we were told is that training new entrants is taking longer than ever before, and that's because of some of the things that we just mentioned earlier. Low unemployment, meaning that you have a smaller talent pool from which to recruit, meaning that you may be forced to hire people that don't have the skills, meaning that you have to do more upskilling when they are recruited, thereby increasing your training costs. Operations usually takes priority over training. What I mean there is that your best ground handler probably isn't going to be the person you employ to train others. Now, why is that? Well, because you want them doing the job that they're so good at, right? And so these ground handling companies were telling us is that actually the trainers, at least talking about internal training here, aren't actually the best people for the job. So we might think about other alternatives. Can we outsource more training? That's certainly a trend that seems to be occurring within the industry. But another thing that they mentioned is that there are few common practices between airlines, which makes it quite difficult, or has made it difficult in the past at least, to have some kind of standardized training and initiation program into the sector. I understand that IATA has recently introduced such standards. You will be much more knowledgeable about them than I am. I think it's IGOM, which will hopefully help to bring some standardization to the industry and help us all to become much more efficient in how we train staff. So, what's being done? A couple of things I want to mention here. First of all, digital training, or the rise of e-learning. I think that most, if not all of you, are probably aware of that trend. It kind of makes sense, it's intuitive, bringing people out of the classroom and into an online or blended learning environment. Our research found that within this sector, in-person training is predicted to decrease by 22%. And that's not just saying reduce by a fifth, that's saying at the moment it accounts for about 65% of all training. In 3 years' time, it'll drop below the 50% mark. And actually, only about 45% of training within ground handling will be delivered face-to-face in the classroom. Instead, it will be delivered using online or blended learning methods. A few specific examples here. A few ground handlers are telling us that they are investing heavily in app-based learning. The advantage there is that it can be deployed very, very easily and very, very quickly. It can be deployed while those 3 people are sitting waiting for the airplane to come in, you don't have to send them for a day into a classroom to do it. You just say, can you do this quick 20-minute module? So utilizing periods of downtime to train staff means that A, your training costs are actually going down because app-based learning is much cheaper than face-to-face classroom learning. But secondly, you're saving money because you're making better use of downtime, and therefore you might actually not have to have as many people employed within your workforce to replace the people who otherwise would have been in a classroom, right? So, rise of e-learning and sort of smarter ways of training staff means that on-the-job training to support operations is going to become much more possible over the next few years. And those training methods are available. We're not sort of looking far into the distance and thinking, oh, wouldn't that be nice? We are already seeing this trend occurring. I have another meaty quote for you. I'll just pick out the highlights here. We're training people on the tarmac. Virtual reality, which, by the way, is still really expensive, but we might imagine as VR and augmented reality training methods become more entrenched, the costs will come down, right? We're looking at how the young employees consume technology or training best, and it's in the form of mobile. That does introduce another challenge, by the way, which is how do we accommodate perhaps the older generation within our workforce that might not be so tech savvy or might not be as open to something like app-based or virtual reality learning. That's something that we do need to look at, and that's something that could be built into your recruitment processes, or even training people how to use those training methods. But certainly, accommodating the preferences of young employees will be vital for the health of the sector moving into the long term. So some food for thought on training. How can ground service providers, airlines, and airports work better together to develop more standardization, what we did find is that there are tensions, maybe that's the word I'll use often, between ground handlers, airports, and airlines as far as who has responsibility for employees, training, working conditions, things like that. So working together more collaboratively to develop more standardized training methods, I think will reap benefits within your sector. And how can we ensure that our existing employees become digital ready? That might be easier for some than it is for others, but we just need to make sure that they are, so that they can realize the benefits of those new training methods. Finally, the R word, retention. We found that most ground handlers, small, mid-sized and large ground handlers, tend to have a turnover rate or a churn rate of somewhere between 30 and 50%. When we first started doing research for IATA, I had to look twice when I saw those figures. I thought, that cannot be right. We cannot possibly lose between a third and half of our employees every single year. The facts are the facts, and we were told time and time again, this is what our churn rate is. One of the very largest companies told me that their churn rate was 32%, and they were delighted that it was 32%. So the challenges are quite obvious, I would hope. First of all, the industry is no longer seen to be attractive, at least when we think about ground handling roles. Aviation perhaps has lost the glamour that it once had, and working below the wing in the pouring rain when it's freezing rain and negative temperatures outside doesn't exactly scream comfort, does it? Frankly, working inside at Walmart or McDonald's flipping burgers seems like a walk in the park compared to all that. So that was a really key finding from the research, is when we asked about who your competition is for jobs. Your competitors are not Swissport and Fraport and Menzies and all of the other ground handlers. Your competitors are McDonald's and KFC and Tesco and Walmart, and that kind of industry is where people are leaving ground handling to go and work, or just not even approaching ground handling in the first place. We also saw that there is very, very little loyalty to companies, even among those who want to stay in the sector. We had a few people telling us that employees will, quote unquote, use them for gaining training, qualifications in the first 6 months, and then they'll leave in order to get a higher salary somewhere else. And that's so frustrating when we've invested all that in an employee for them to leave for another organization just because I've now been trained up and I've got my qualifications and I'm off. I want to get a job where I might be put inside for 20 hours a week rather than on the tarmac. So in light of those challenges, what ground handlers are doing is they're looking more closely than ever before at the employer brand. How can we make our organization more attractive to work for in the first place, and more likely that they will want to stay here? And that's not just about improving working conditions, but that is a part of it. It's about developing a clear and consistent career path for employees, whether you're coming in at the supervisor or managerial level or at entry level. Quite a few of the ground handlers we spoke to said that they have programs such as, anybody can become the CEO of this company. Okay? And that might seem sort of fluffy and a bit aspirational, but actually, if executed correctly, employer brand programs have shown in other industries, have been shown to reduce significantly the churn of entry-level staff. But it isn't just about saying you could become the CEO if you want to. It's about, as I said, improving working conditions, looking at benefits, making sure that we remain competitive. One ground handler that I spoke to personally was saying that they find it really, really difficult to hire supervisor and managerial roles externally. 70% of their managerial roles are promotional hires, internal hires. But she said, that is by necessity, not by choice. And the reason is because their remuneration packages are not competitive for supervisors. They're just simply not. And again, we're not necessarily comparing ourselves just against ground handlers. We're comparing ourselves against retail, food service, those other sectors which people might be interested in. So having a better and clearer career path, revisiting rewards and benefit packages, and improving company culture, just little things like making sure that there are appropriate break room facilities so that when people come in from the freezing rain, they have somewhere to rest and to dry off. Goodness me, that's the meatiest quote of them all. We had one ground handler, global operations, saying that we're open and generous compared to our competitors. The main driver in what we've seen in reducing turnover rates is communicating that all employees will have a chance for a career at our organization. This is not just a fixed-term contract or a seasonal job. This is somewhere that we would like you to see as being a career opportunity for you. Some food for thought on retention. Could investing more in the employees that we've already got actually save money, and those costs could be offset by reducing recruitment or even training? You could look at that as a different way, actually. You could pull any one of these levers. You could say, let's invest more in training so that our recruitment costs go down and our churn goes down. However we look at it, we are looking at pulling different levers here, and so whether we invest more in training or raise salaries for our workers, however we choose to do that, reducing churn, I think, is the real key here, because the fewer employees you need to rehire every year, the less you're going to spend on various other parts of your HR budget. We want a healthier working environment with more loyal staff. And with that, I'm getting a 40-second warning on my screen here. That's all I've got to show you today. So this was very much an introduction to those challenges. I wish I could stay here for 2 or 3 hours. I'm sure I would induce death by PowerPoint at that point. But I hope you found this interesting. Even if most of the things I've said to you were already sort of on your radar. So we've got about 8 seconds for questions. Or no seconds for questions, as the case may be. But I can stick around if you have any. Oh, I've got time. OK, brilliant. Does anyone have any questions? Blimey, there must be some sore heads from the gala dinner, after all. You certainly can.
Again, if I look at it from a particularly a U.S. perspective, one of the things that prevents getting people on the ramp is that they have to have a 10-year background check. They have to pass a drug and alcohol or a drug screening. Did that come out in any of your studies as being a impediment to hiring people in?
It did, absolutely, especially when we think about what the requirements might be for some of the other industries that we talked about as being the competition, if you will. Because aviation is a sort of high safety, high risk environment, we understand that those requirements are absolutely necessary, right? But what it does mean is that I don't want to wait until my background check comes through, or maybe I wouldn't pass that background check and I can go and work at McDonald's or KFC instead. And by the way, I'll work inside all day and I'll earn more money doing it. So you can see the incentives for actually working certainly in an entry-level position are certainly being eroded and offset by what you could get elsewhere. It was something that came up for sure. Yeah. Yes?
You have some other comments?
Oh, sorry. And then we'll go to you. Hiya.
Yeah, Bob Rogers from Your Care. This is kind of coming back to the question I raised actually on the first morning, because everything you say is absolutely correct.
Yeah.
But what I feel is the missing piece in this jigsaw is nobody is thinking about how to actually reduce the amount of people required to turn around an airplane.
Yeah.
We've got Boeing and Airbus making ever bigger airplanes, but still loading them with the same manual loading processes that existed 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow somebody's got to unlock this. Your presentation needs to be being made not to us, but to the airline people who are going to unlock the money to develop these new technologies in the aircraft loading process.
Yeah. I take your point. It's a very good one, and you're quite right that that is one of the keys here. We've talked a lot today about how we can keep the right people within our organizations and reduce churn, and we're talking solely about the human resource, but actually investments in automation and advances in technology might mean that we don't need, even if our churn rate stays the same, we might not need so many people. What I will say is that there were, how can I phrase this? There were initiatives that were mentioned as part of our research, but as you might imagine, they were kept under pretty strict lock and key. And so we weren't able to present those examples to you today. But I think the wheels are turning in some areas of the industry. But I completely agree with you. I think airlines need to be approached here, or at least in the research context, to find out what they're doing and what might encourage them to release the sort of investment that you're talking about there. I completely agree. Yes, we had this person at the back.
Thanks, Antonio Sucor from Cabo Verde Airlines. I just want to ask you, how do you do the correlation between the self-checking, everything is now is digital, and this project for the grant of the jobs in the...
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
About the correlation between the self-checking, web checking. If you see now in the airport, everything is automatic, it is digital, and this project of grant of the work in the ground operation. How you do use fit that correlation?
So I hope I've understood your question correctly here. Jump in if I haven't, but I think what we did see is that everyone knows that the passenger experience is becoming more automated, right? But as I said before, there's that premiumization, so the customer service roles are still going to be required. But I think the automation above the wing, or at least the experience, the automated experience above the wing is more advanced than the experience below the wing. And so what we heard from a number of ground handlers that we spoke to was that actually the major advances in operational automation are still some way off. I hope that answered your question, but please do let me know if I'm missing anything there. Yeah?
Thank you very much. I think we need to move on to the next part of the program, but we really enjoyed your presentation, and there are things we know about, but you really kind of quantified and put a different spotlight on them.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure. And if I could just take 10 seconds to let you know that imminently there will be a white paper based on these pieces of research that will be released in conjunction with IATA. And so you can expect that sort of in your inboxes or on your radar, I hope, in the very near future.
Great.
OK. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. We're going to do something to keep our focus on people in ground handling real quickly. A few days ago, IATA started an initiative to recognize people in ground handling. And we invited ground handlers across the world to submit a picture of them and their teams at work on the ramp. There was a lot of interest, and a large number of photos were submitted. They've been narrowed down to just 3. And we want to use the IGHC audience here to judge which of the 3 is the best. We're not going to do a big, complicated process. No links and emails. We're just going to show you the 3 pictures and use your applause as our measure to determine which one is our winner. So here they are. We have photo X, photo Y, and photo Z. Take a minute to look at them, see what you think. Color, activity. What do they say about people working on the ramp? We don't have any that are in the rain and snow, unfortunately, or de-icers, but we have 3. So if you've thought about it, what I'd like you to do is to clap to indicate which one is your favorite. And I'm going to ask that instead of clapping for all 3, to just choose the one that you think is the best and clap at that point. And then we'll use that kind of volume as our measure. So right now I'd like to ask those of you who think photo X is the best, put your hands together. Okay, I think that got an 80 on the applause-o-meter, right? Is that correct? Okay. Now photo Y. Put your hands together for Y. And that went up to about 55 or so. And finally, we have photo Z. Put your hands together on Z. Okay. In an informal judgment, I'm going to declare that photo Z is the winner. I think they're all 3 good pictures of different parts of ramp operation. My heart is actually with the fuelers, but I do like this one because it's, we're waiting on the aircraft to come in, and then we're going to jump on it just like that pit team did in the pictures. So, thank you very much for your help on that.